cultivated all the way from the northern latitudes of North America, Florida, California, into the Great Plains, all the way through Central America and the Mayan ruins into Central America and lowland tropical areas, as well as South America. So they were widely cultivated. They're not just pockets of cultivation when we got here. There we go. Now, one of the things you might have heard of is the method called the Three Sisters, which Native Americans used. And the Three Sisters included corn, beans, and squash. And the corn plant was the climbing apparatus, or the trellis for the bean, and then the squash was around the outside. And it's kind of becoming popular with the people that are more interested in native crops and so forth to start doing this. As a matter of fact, I know people that use this technique in their garden with the Three Sisters. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Corn and beans together give you all the amino acids you need. You don't need to eat meat. You can get all of your amino acids with those two crops alone, and squash is pretty good to eat along with it. Nutritional value of beans is high. I'm not going to go into all the details. Lots of high protein, micronutrients, and so forth. It's I'll go back here. Low glycemic index if you eat them. High in complex carbohydrates, good protein source, and rich in antioxidants. We know that the health benefits are tremendous, both from preclinical studies, clinical studies, and epidemiological studies. There's good evidence to show that the risk of cancer is reduced with beans in the diet, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. And beans are unique in this regard. We're not seeing it in all of the crops. Production and consumption in parts of Africa, people consume 140 pounds of beans a year. That's a lot of beans. And here in the United States, we consume about 6.2. In these parts of Africa, they don't eat meat. They don't have meat, so it's a good substitute for protein, which, and Steve aptly pointed out that wheat, rice, and corn are the major food producers, but you got to have some protein in your diet. So beans on those tortillas taste pretty damn good to me. In Colorado, just to wrap up, where did your food come from that you're going to enjoy today? It comes locally. And so I'm just going to quickly review Colorado bean production. First of all, we grow primarily 3 different market classes: pintos, light red kidneys. There are Anasazi beans. They're grown in the southwestern part of Colorado. Some small areas of black bean production, but pintos are 90 to 95%. They're planted in late May, early June. Traditionally, we don't grow them using the Three Sisters method. Pretty much highly mechanized and cultivated. About mid-June, late June, early July, we have floral initiation and pod set. Irrigation. 95% of the beans grown in Colorado are irrigated either through furrow irrigation or surface irrigation, overhead irrigated. They're harvested with machines. First of all, they're either windrowed or undercut with a machine, placed in a windrow, and then harvested with the combine. And when you're all done with that, we can cook them, and put them on your plate, and eat them and enjoy them like we all should. Thank you very much.
Wow! So, a plug for beans. I had the pleasure of working with Mark for the last 5 years. I challenge all of you, 1/2 cup of dry bean or more per day. Only 7% of the people in the United States eat bean on any given day. We can do better than that. Let's let Fort Collins in Colorado take the lead, and it will propel us with new fuels for the biological revolution. Now I'm going to reset the timers to make sure that one of the reasons the timer came into play is when I look at my watch, I can't see it anymore, so that's the truth of the matter. We're going to set this, and our next speaker. So, you got corn and beans. What else do you want on your plate? Pat Bettinger from the Department of Biology, trained at the University of California, San Francisco, an expert in pollination, is going to share with us on today. Pat.
Yes, so tomatoes. Why should we care about wild tomatoes? I'm going to acknowledge that many of these slides came from Dr. Roger Shedley, who actually saw one of his slides. He is the director of the Tomato Genetics Resource Center at UC Davis. And this is a picture of Roger. He and I and some of our colleagues went to Peru to study wild tomatoes, and here he's examining Solanum heterocates, which is one of the prettier wild tomatoes, along a river in the Andes Mountains. Okay, tomatoes, as you've been hearing, are members of this plant family called the Solanaceae. There's many poisonous members of this. This used to be called the nightshade family. But there's also members that we know and love as our crops that include the petunias. Coffee is one of the more distant relatives, tobacco, and the peppers and eggplants, and then potatoes and tomatoes. Now, tomatoes are a really good genetic model because unlike potatoes, which have their tetraploid, that means they have sort of too many chromosomes, tomatoes are diploid like we are, and it's much easier to do genetics with a diploid species. And in the very near future, we're going to have the complete genome sequence of tomatoes. So, domesticated tomato, you might be surprised to hear this, but domesticated tomato is actually very poor genetically in that even though you see a wide variety of phenotypes, that means differences in what you can see, there's actually very little genetic variation in our cultivated tomatoes. So all of these are pretty much genetically identical, except for a few genes. Like, for example, fruit color. There's one major gene that will affect food color. There's one major gene that affects fruit shape. So you probably have grown pear tomatoes. You can see that that's a little pear tomato. Another shape gene is fasciated, and that gives you sort of these heirloom type shapes for tomatoes. And then you can get some mottled coloring, and that's due to another gene called green stripe. But other than these few genes that are variable between our cultivated tomato varieties, they're very genetically uniform, which is, not a good thing. It's not a good thing for us or tomatoes. So tomatoes also originate like beans in the Andes, the region of the Andes. But unlike most other crops, it appears, I'm not sure if I really believe this, but it appears that they were actually domesticated elsewhere. So there was a migration, somehow, here we go, of wild species up into Mexico where they were really domesticated. And so that's puzzling to me, but that's what's supposedly happened. Then, of course, they were introduced into Europe after the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. And after they became popular as love animals, they became then reintroduced back into the Americas a couple hundred years later and cultivated there. So that's how the tomato has traveled. As domestication occurs, what happens is your population goes through what's called a bottleneck. And as domestication occurs, you're selecting for sweetness and fruit size and all these different kinds of flavors. And what happens during that process is that each time the crops move continents, you lose more and more and more genetic diversity. And so cultivated tomato has been through numerous genetic bottlenecks, which makes its genetic base smaller and smaller and smaller. So that can actually lead to major problems. So if you look at just genetic variability and you compare the cultivated tomato to its wild relatives, you can see there's a tiny, tiny sliver of genetic variability in our cultivated tomato.